Hello and welcome to our Strategic Compass program.
Hello.
Today I'm particularly happy because we are joined by Professor Jacques Sapir of Paris. He's a professor of economics and particularly a worldwide known expert on Russian economy. Professor Sapir was out trying to explain at the onset of the war in Ukraine that sanctions would not break Russia, that sanctions would actually do the boomerang role because those who actually sanction Russia might actually harm themselves, but nobody listened to him at the time, particularly the politicians. As here in Ankara, I was saying that it is almost impossible to break Russia's resolve militarily or through sanctions and all that. Nobody listened to us at the time. At least the Turkish government did actually listen to us a bit. But Professor Sapir has been actually writing and talking about why Russia's economy is quite solid and unbreakable through sanctions. I've been following his articles, and also I'm a consistent follower of his social media account on Twitter or X. Professor Sapir, welcome to our program today. It's very nice of you to take your time out with us.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be on your chain.
Well, it's our pleasure. Let's get going immediately, if you like. With regard to the Russian economy, as I said, you were quite resolute in your actually analysis that Russia's economy, as well as Chinese economy, these are different types of economies, and it is difficult to break these economies through usual type of Western sanctions, financial sanctions and blah, blah. And you were also pointing out, particularly, the usual calculations in the Western economic discipline, that, this is the sort of your GDP per head, and Russian GDP is just equals the Spanish GDP. So that's about all. It's a simple power, not to be reckoned with seriously and all that. And you were particularly pointing at the service sector, which actually inflate the Western economic growth and the power of the Western economies. Can you give us your first? I mean, all you've said has come out true. You are a hero now. So please tell us, give us your first take.
Well, thank you very much. As a matter of fact, when you have, of course, capitalist economies, but of a specific kind of capitalism, the fact to try to measure the growth or the level of these economies by using a kind of standardized exchange rate, usually the US dollar, in US dollar, is bound to fail because this change rate doesn't reflect the exact power of these economies. And that's why we had to use another measure, which is the purchasing power parity, which is much more reliable. I'm not to say that the purchasing power parity is the best of all the systems, but it is still much more reliable than using exchange rate comparison. And if you look at the purchasing power parity, you will see that Russia was and is the fourth country in the world, after, of course, China, the United States, and India. But now, the Russian GDP, of course, in purchasing power parity, has overcome both the Japanese and the German GDP. This is giving you a completely different understanding of what is the economic power of Russia. By the same token, I will say that the same reasoning is also applying to China. China, in exchange rate comparison, is coming under the United States. And if you are using purchasing power parity, which is even more meaningful for China than for Russia, you will see that the Chinese GDP has overcome the one of the United States in 2017. That is nearly 8 years ago. So it's extremely important to keep that in the mind. And all the discussion, all the talk about, well, Russia doesn't exist in economy. Russia is a kind of another petro state. Russian GDP is equal to the one of Spain, and so on and so on. It's completely stupid. Then another point. What is the share of the industry in the GDP? It's extremely important when you are looking at the war potential of a country or the ability of this country to resist some external factors like sanctions. We know that the share of the industry is more or less at 15% for the United States, 14% for France, which is quite low, as a matter of fact, and it is around 26% for Russia. Germany is among Western countries, a country which is not very different from Russia from this point of view, and the industrial share of the GDP is around 25%. This is also another extremely important point. So there is absolutely no surprise that Russia has been able to resist the level of sanction which was applied by Western power. By the way, also important to have in mind, the Russian government has acknowledged the impact of sanctions implemented in 2014 and 2015. By then, the impact of sanction has been quite important. I am not to say that these sanctions have destroyed the Russian economy. They didn't. But nevertheless, Russia was in recession for 2 years. 2 years. And the Russian government took actions, financial actions, the creation of the yuan market on the Moscow stock market. Something I know quite well because I've been working with people from the Russian Central Bank for years, but also it implemented a kind of diversification of its economy. So when Western sanctions become to be applied to Russia in 2022, end of February, beginning of March, Russia was much better prepared to resist this sanction than in 2014. This is a point which has been tragically ignored by Western politicians. One of my former students, Mr. Morad Bali, actually wrote a paper using a VAR regression, and it demonstrated that already in 2014, nevertheless, the impact on the Russian economy, the cost of sanction has been equal between Russia and Western countries. Now, using the same methodology, he arrived to the conclusion that more than 75 or 80% of the cost of sanctions has been borne by Western economies, mostly European economies, Western European economies, and this was, as a matter of fact, linked to energy price. The boomerang effect of energy price has been a disaster for the German economy, which has seen its energy cost doubled or even multiplied by a factor of 3. And of course, for the Italian economy, much less for France, because France was much less exposed to this question of energy. We have a large nuclear energy sector, which are to some to some point shielding us from this effect. So, what is called the boomerang effect has been very, very high. A last point: if you are looking on the historical record of economic sanctions, beginning in the 30s, sanctions against fascist Italy when it invaded Abyssinia.
Abyssinia.
Yeah, Ethiopia. Well, the Abyssinian War in 1935. But you have plenty of examples of sanctions, unilateral sanctions, which are now so-called illegal, and legal sanctions, that is sanctions which are approved by the Security Council of the United Nations. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you are looking to the track record of the sanctions, you are seeing that very, very few examples are of a political will of a country being broken by these sanctions. And we have to look to Cuba, to Iran. Iran has been extremely strongly sanctioned, and so far there is absolutely no change. North Korea also. So, as a matter of fact, decision-making leaders will have to acknowledge the fact that using the tool of economic sanctions was bound to lead to very, very few results. And I think that the absence of this kind of historical look on sanctions records, and we have a huge number of sanctions. So this lack of look on the historical record of sanctions has been a tragedy, because it launched a kind of insane policy for the European Union, a policy where effect of sanctions were much bigger on the European Union than on the country which was sanctioned, yes. That's Russia.
Well, 2 points. One is about sanctions in general in a historical perspective. Actually, Turkey has also been sanctioned every now and again by the West, in particular in the defense industry sector. And what we say in Turkey, thanks to the sanctions, now we have a thriving defense industry in this country, and Turkey has become a net exporter.
Yes.
And it is just about to produce its own 5th generation fighter plane, on a par with F-35, if not better, and, French Rafale, presumably a little better and more in terms of, you know, cutting edge technology and all that. So the sanctions actually don't always produce the desired effect. So
Absolutely.
they should have looked at your writings, your suggestions, your analysis, but they didn't. Now, the second point, you know, there has been the devastating effect of the sanctions on the European economies, as you explained. Meanwhile, can you tell us more about the Russian restructuring of their own economy from 2014, 2022 in basically in about 8 years or less than 8 years, they managed to restructure their economy in every sense. So as we all go to Russia, we see that, you know, the country, there is hardly any sign of harmful effect on the economy of the ongoing war, for instance. How did they get at that? So it's a spectacular success, isn't it?
Well, first point, the government policy has been quite wise, even if all measures have not been implemented at once, certainly, but they decided in 2015 to implement a major switch to Asia for their oil and gas export. As a matter of fact, this has been in the coming since the publication in 2010 of the energy strategy of the Russian government, looking at 2013. You know, it's classical. It's a kind of very important decision-making paper, and we have studied it in my research center. I had 3 students who wrote their PhD on the Russian energy strategy. So I know fairly well the topic. And it was absolutely obvious that the Russian government, already in 2009, because the paper has been public by 2010, so we can imagine that there have been a lot of discussions under closed doors in 2008 and 2009. The paper pointed to the dependency of Russia toward Western Europe and said it was unsustainable in the long term, and Russia had to switch to Asia, if only because the oil and gas demand in Asia were to grow much more than in Western Europe. So already we had this kind of switch. But of course, we had also a lot of measures like the substitutions of importations, which were implemented between 2015 and 2022. The second point is that, well, sanctions had an effect on the Russian economy. If you are looking to economic data, you see the effect in April and May 2022. By then, the Russian GDP contracted by probably 4 or 5%. So yes, there was an effect. But this effect was short-lived. As a matter of fact, Russia regained its its GDP 11 months later. So most of the effect of sanctions was for an 11 months time, and were mostly concentrated on the 3 first months. Now, Of course, sanctions have still an effect. They are raising import price. Of course, Russia can import what it wants, but it is using a lot of different schemes for imports, and of course, you have cost in that. So we can attribute part of the Russian inflation to this problem. I think that cost of imported products, and imported products are not the whole production, costs have been raised by 20% by the necessity to use different import schemes and not the direct one. Okay, that's absolutely true. Another point is the fact that the Russian industry had to restructure. Of course, it was in a process of restructuration since 2015, 2016, but it had to do this restructuration much more quickly because of the sanction. And it has cost. It cost a lot of money. The huge investment effort made by Russia, 4% in 2022, when the GDP contracted by more or less 1.1%. Okay, then more than 8% increase of investment in 2023, and again more than 8% in 2024. This has a cost. This is changing the repartition share between investment, profit, and wage. And as wage have increased also very fast, all that is constraining the finance of some enterprise. Although, well, it's not true everywhere. Some enterprises are making huge profits and could perfectly support the increase in cost. But for some others, yes, there was a problem in the increase in costs. And what is extremely interesting is to look at the internal structure of the industry, because you're seeing that some sectors are booming, other sectors are facing some difficulties. I'm not to say that they are to crumble in the coming months. There are still some difficulties as a metallurgy.
Which sectors, for instance, the service sector in particular?
No, for one reason. Because of the huge increase in wage and in actual wage, not nominal wage, household spending have been extremely high. So part of the service sectors boomed. Now, if you look into the industrial structure, the production of some raw or semi-processed materials, like the metallurgy, has been stagnant for the last 12 months, more or less. They have not retreated much, but they've been stagnant. On the contrary, the electronic industry, the electric equipment industry, chemicals, also a lot of industry linked to household consumptions. Okay, they have boomed, with a considerable increase in production. The more has been the electronic industry. This is probably linked to war procurement, by the way. The electronic industry gained more than 40% in the first 12 months after the beginning of the war, and again nearly 50% the next year. So it is increasing very much. But when you are looking to a civilian industry like the automotive industry, the construction of cars for families. Of course, this branch has been heavily hit by the sanctions. And at one point, the monthly productions was down to 20,000 units a month. Now it's again between 80,000 and 90,000.
18 to 19. So it has recovered its losses.
It has completely recovered, and it is at the level of 2019 before the COVID pandemics.
It is incredible.
Yes.
It's a huge success.
It's a huge success, and it's a success in the civilian industry. So this restructuration is working, and another important point is that in 2019, the share of the raw material sector in the industry, the extracting industry, was higher than in the manufacturing industry. Now it's the reverse. The manufacturing industry is much more important than the extracting industry, which has not declined or for just a margin. It is just the increase in production of the manufacturing industry. And this is also very important in the transformation of the Russian industry and the Russian economy.
Well, thank you. There are a few other aspects perhaps we need to look at. One is the Russian assets frozen in the Western banks. I think the European banks have frozen much more than the American banks. Now, we are recording this program, and I think our Harici group is going to put it on the anniversary of the war, which is quite meaningful. And so Trump lately, just yesterday, his defense minister basically bashed all his European colleagues and the leaders by saying, well, no more war in Ukraine. We are disinterested in the war. No US money, no US weapons, no blah, blah. So basically, first of all, would you agree that actually what Trump is doing and saying is tantamount to acknowledging the fact that Russian economy has not broken down first. It is doing much better than the European economies, and militarily, there is no way of winning this war. So it's an acknowledgement from an economic perspective too, not only from a military perspective. But the second, the question is about the assets. Now, if this is going to bring about a peace process, presumably the United States is going to lift its sanctions on Russia. And Russia is also going to lift some of either some or all the sanctions that it has placed on its exports to the United States too. So what about then, how would you assess the chances that the Russians will get their assets from the European banks and others?
Well, on the first point, yes, this is an acknowledgement that, to put it bluntly, Russia has won the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Economically, because not only it resisted sanction, but it grew under sanction. And militarily, we can see that on different news coming from the line of front, the line of fire. So this is important for the United States because Ukraine has never been a high point in the US diplomacy, and even more with the coming of Trump government. For Trump government, the most important priority are, number one, China. That's very clear. Number two, the Middle East. Partly for ideological reasons. That is, Trump wants to be remembered as the US president who bring peace to the Middle East. Okay. That's a very, very complex point. I'm not sure that it will succeed, but still, Middle East is clearly the number two in the US agenda. Point three, internal affairs are the wall, curbing illegal immigrants, and all that. And then four is Ukraine. When you are in the fourth positions, this is tantamount of saying that you will be deleted from the agenda. Because one experience that I had working with the French government and also the Russian government is that any administration can focus on more than 2 or 3 points. And the other point, okay, they could be quite important, but still you can focus on them. And this is extremely important. This is why the US government is trying to shift Ukraine cost onto the European. And the European could not bear the cost. It could even not bear the military part of the cost. And so we will see what will be happening. European countries can well say, well, the US policy is tantamount of selling Ukraine to Putin, blah, 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 blah. But what could they do, actually?
Exactly. Actually, sorry to intervene in between, but there has been a sudden change of discourse in the European capitals, as well as in the statements of the NATO Secretary General. Yes. They appeared to be quite hawkish initially, as if they were going to remain on their high horse. But then they said, well, you know, this being the case, all we want is to be present at the negotiating table. You know, Europe should be there, and perhaps Ukraine should be there too. But the United States is saying, you know, sorry, but, you know, we don't give a damn whether you are there or not. But we are going to strike a deal with Russia.
Yes. So that's an obvious point. Then on the second point, the frozen assets. Well, I think that the lifting, at least of part of US sanctions against Russia, is in the coming. I'm not saying that all the sanctions will be lifted. I don't believe that. But at least part of the sanctions will be lifted in the deal that will be made between Trump and Vladimir Putin. And then the problem will be in the European hands. What the European Union is to do, to stick to sanctions, but that will destroy even more the European economy, or to acknowledge the fact that the US have lifted part of the sanctions, and they had to lift part of the sanctions. Now, what part? I think that European governments will be much more interested by sanctions on oil and gas trade, But the Russian government could be much more interested by the problem of frozen assets, if only because on these questions, the European Union has quite obviously broken international law. So I think that if European countries want to have again access to Russian oil and gas at a much lower price than now, because we are still using Russian oil and gas, but through
definitely.
Yes,
Professor Sapir, I mean, this is incredible because countries like Turkey and quite a number of others are buying Russian oil at a discounted price.
Yes.
They produce things out of it, you know, gas and diesel and what have you, and sell it to European countries at exorbitant prices, and the Europeans think that this is a success because they are sanctioning Russia.
Yes. Even
Absolute idiocy,
India is doing the same.
Oh yes, I think Morocco.
Indian imports of Russian oils have raised 20 times
Incredible.
above a 2021 level. Okay, so Russian government is to tell European government, if you want again access to the Russian energy, first you will have to repair the infrastructure, the Nord Stream gas pipe, and second, you will have to unfreeze Russian assets. That's extremely important. So I think that we will have this negotiation once the deal between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will be made. So I think that the deal and the general agreement on Ukraine is probably to be made between early April and June this year, because you know we have still a lot of technicalities to be solved in this deal. But once it will be made by end June, then it will be the turn to Western Europe and to the European governments to reach a deal with Russia. And I think that this could, at least partly, break the European Union, because some government will not wait for the European Union to make his mind, and will try to come to an agreement with Russia much quicker. The Hungarian government, maybe the Romanian government. We don't see what will be the second turn of presidential elections, but I think it's quite probable. The Slovakian government, and so forth. So
also perhaps German government, because we don't know who is going to come to power actually after the elections.
I think that it will be a kind of ground coalitions between the CDU-CSU and the Socialist and the Social Democratic Party. But still, yes, you're right. The German industry is pushing the government and saying we can't sustain Chinese competitions with so high energy price. If you want that we stay in Germany, otherwise we will delocalize into the United States, which will be catastrophic for Germany. If you want that we will stay in Germany, you have to lower the energy price. And the only way to lower the energy price is to reach an agreement with Russia. And Russia will say, okay, but then you have to repair infrastructure, because it's you, not specifically Germany, but it's you, the West, which destroyed the infrastructure. You have to rebuild them.
What about the other side of the assets? Actually, if I'm not mistaken, the Russian government has ordered this seizure of all the Western countries, companies, assets in Russia, because, you know, it could be a luxurious hotel, it could be something else, or even the Russian airlines planes. I think many of them were on a leasing, and they have ordered the seizure of all that lately. If there is going to be a deal between Europeans and Russia about the defreezing of the Russian assets in the European banks, that would also involve, you know, the de-seizure of the Russian takeover of the Western companies' assets, and then the Western companies would go back to Russia. Huh?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I don't think that many Western companies will go back for just one reason, is that the place is already occupied by Russian companies now. Look at the huge investment made by the Renault car making company, the Renault Nissan company in Russia. It has been wasted. As a matter of fact, the State Institute for the Development of Automobile Industry has taken control of Avtovaz, has taken control of all the French money spent in Avtovaz, is not to give it back. And Renault has acknowledged that. Now, for the now policy of seizing Western assets, of course, it will be part of the negotiation. It will be part of the negotiation. I don't think that all assets will be de-seized, but I think that actually you could have some assets which will be returned to their Western owners. But here again, it is to be part of the discussion. And that's why that the discussion might be quite protracted because we have such a number of technical problems in the negotiation. It could not be achieved in 1 month or 2 months.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sapir. You know, it's been a very enjoyable conversation and interview. We are going to put it on, as I mentioned, YouTube on Harici channel. Harici means exterior, by the way. So it focuses on foreign news and analysis solely. So that is why it's Harici. And then, you know, meanwhile, thank you very much for all your analysis and for all your views, sharing it, for sharing them all with us. If you have anything to add, please go ahead. Otherwise, you know, we can call it a day.
No, thank you very much. I much liked to have this discussion with you. It's quite breathing fresh airs when you are coming from the highly ideologically motivated discussion in France. So thank you very much.
Well, we thank you again for this illuminating interview. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our program for today. We'll get together again with another expert on another important topic. And but for now, bye-bye.
Thank you.